Hey everyone, welcome back to more satisfying pro-revenge tales. My terrible, entitled new boss set me up and blamed me for stealing, even though I was completely innocent and ultimately let me go without any real justification. I then collected proof and brought down his entire operation. Let's jump straight into it. The first story is called My Boss Demanded Efficiency, so I complied maliciously. I've been in my field for quite some time and have always felt a sense of pride in delivering thorough, dependable work. I'm a strong performer with a proven track record under previous supervisors who genuinely valued quality and reliability. But when Eric stepped in as our new boss, everything shifted dramatically. Eric was obsessed with efficiency. He came from a startup background where things didn't have to be flawless, just adequate and quick. He wanted tasks wrapped up rapidly, even if it meant skipping important steps. In team meetings, he loved tossing out lines like time is money and every second counts. Sure, being efficient matters, but Eric pushed it to an unreasonable extreme. He had zero interest in the quality of our output. He simply wanted it finished immediately. Nuance, quality checks, and verification were thrown completely out the door. Then he decided to roll out what he called a time tracking and output policy. This involved logging every single task with strict time limits attached. Anything that ran over his arbitrary deadlines got flagged, and we'd have to justify ourselves during weekly efficiency reviews. Essentially, the new rule boiled down to don't worry about doing it right, just do it fast. I attempted to explain that rushing would inevitably cause mistakes, but Eric insisted this approach would maximize productivity. Frustrated, yet willing to play along by his rules, I decided to give him precisely what he was asking for. If Eric wanted speed, speed is what he'd get. So I stopped reviewing everything twice. Tasks that would normally require an hour to refine, I was knocking out in 15 minutes, barely even glancing at them. Documents that needed careful analysis got a quick data dump, and nothing more. Anything that typically received a thorough review now got a single, hasty pass at best. Naturally, as you'd expect, errors started multiplying. Typos, wrong figures, misplaced data, sloppy presentations. Mistakes were showing up everywhere. But technically, I was working well within Eric's time limits. Eric was thrilled with how rapidly I was churning through work and began boasting in meetings about how productive our team had become. And then the clients started noticing. One of our biggest accounts discovered a major mistake in a document I'd thrown together at lightning speed, which triggered an uncomfortable phone call with Eric. More problems kept surfacing, and after roughly 2 weeks of optimized efficiency, I was called into his office alongside his boss. Eric, visibly agitated at this point, demanded to know why the quality of my work had dropped so sharply. I calmly responded that I had been following all of his time limits precisely as instructed. I pointed out that quality work requires adequate time, something I simply didn't have under his new policy. Eric sat there in silence as it dawned on him that his own policy had backfired spectacularly. His boss stared at him, completely floored and red-faced. After an uncomfortable pause, Eric mumbled something about reconsidering the time limits on certain tasks. The so-called efficiency policy quietly faded away not long after. Now I'm back to doing my job the right way. Eric is under a performance review, and his boss is closely monitoring all our operations, particularly with major clients. I mean, why fix what isn't broken? And why try to rein in your top performers just to assert your authority? The next one is the pro-revenge story titled, Boss Framed Me for Theft. I ruined his career. And by the way, dear Ripe Stars, let me know in the comments. Do you prefer pro-revenge or malicious compliance stories? Also, please don't forget to hit like on the video because it would be incredible if we could hit 1,000 likes. So, for some background, my boss owns 2 bakeries. One performs significantly better than the other, and the second one has basically been neglected. It brings in a modest amount of revenue, and I'll come back to that. I work as a baker at a well-known baking franchise chain in Australia. I genuinely loved it, until fairly recently, when a coworker left after having a child and a replacement was brought in. Oh boy, this replacement. This guy is King Dick, the biggest knob I've ever had the displeasure of working alongside. Within about 2 months, I'd essentially been banished to the underperforming store. I'd never worked there before, so I was genuinely dreading it. This new guy had been running everyone into the ground, dug his roots in deep, and had worked his way into the boss's ear pretty effectively. When I arrived at the sister store, I was genuinely stunned by what I found. Production was minimal, and it had long been a joke back at the main store, and it wasn't hard to understand why. Half the ovens either had no power or had busted heating elements that couldn't reach temperature. The mixing bowl let out a shriek every time it was switched on, a clear sign its bearings desperately needed replacing. The retarder and provers had massive gaping holes in them and were flooding with water on a daily basis. And the other baker on site, who we'll call Steve, was already at his breaking point. Steve had been there for around 3 years and hadn't even known that King Dick had been hired, but he knew him well. It turned out that Steve and King Dick had both been apprentices at the same store before King Dick was let go for theft. You can all see exactly where this is heading. I worked at the sister store for roughly 6 months over the Easter season alongside Steve, and it was grueling. Trays were never replaced. Some had actual cracks in them. I still don't understand how that's even possible. The provers constantly needed mopping halfway through a shift. And because the non-slip flooring was so old it had become dangerously slick, full of breaks and gaps, the whole place reeked of damp, moldy water that nobody could get to because it seeped underneath the flooring. In short, the place was disgusting. About 3 months ago, I received some terrible news. Josh, a close friend of mine at the main store, had been let go. Money had been going missing from the store, upwards of $3,000 over the course of several months. There was no actual evidence pointing to Josh, but it didn't matter. King Dick had been quietly working on the boss's perception, and little by little, Josh was written up for the most trivial things, none of which were even his fault. He was dismissed after his third unfair strike. He planned to take the case to Fair Work Australia, but I had bigger plans. The first step was to walk into the provers with my phone, pull it out of my pocket, and snap a nice, clear photograph of the floor. Photo available upon request. My second step was to file a fake complaint on a hot day to the head office about the store I was currently working at, posing as a customer. I demanded to know how a place could be this filthy with nothing being done about it for so long. I told them it reeked of damp mold, which it genuinely did on hot days. We kept fans and an air conditioner blowing toward the customer area constantly to mask the smell. They said they'd follow up. I told them not to bother. I wouldn't be coming back. The third step was to report the situation to WorkSafe, the government body responsible for worker safety. I requested to remain anonymous and attached the photograph. I informed them about the faulty ovens, the dodgy mixing bowl, and mentioned there were additional issues at the main store as well. Since I hadn't been there in months at that point, I couldn't specify exactly what, but I did bring up the loose drain cover out the back that the boss had told us to simply push back into place so nobody twisted an ankle, never actually fixing it properly. So it kept coming loose whenever someone stepped on it or rolled a bin over it the wrong way. They arrived at the sister store and shut it down within 20 minutes. There was a whole list of violations, likely more than I had even reported. The place was an absolute disaster zone, and it was obvious they weren't messing around. I had a couple of days off and discovered during that time that the main store had also been shut down. Inspectors found rust inside the retarder and mold growing inside its fans, which had been blowing mold spores all over the product mint for the following day. In short, both locations were closed. It's going to cost the boss tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in machinery replacements, flooring repairs, and fines. The boss pinned all of it on Josh, largely because King Dick pushed that narrative. But if he'd gotten his facts straight, he wouldn't have lost his business. Every staff member received a severance package, including King Dick. But at least I know I'll never have to work alongside him again. I'd rather do something truly disgusting than go through that experience once more. The next one is a brilliant, deeply satisfying, malicious compliance story you absolutely won't want to miss, titled "Crappy Boss Will Forever Regret Trying to Bring the Thunder." And by the way, guys, if you'd like to share your own malicious compliance or awful boss stories with the community, head over to /ripe stories on Reddit, where you can post full-length stories that I might read in a future video. So, I started working in elderly care before I even finished school, at age 17, as a temp worker. After graduating, I essentially worked full-time for several years and finally landed steady employment at age 23. I take real pride in what I do, and even though I never studied anything medical, I've always made a point of learning everything necessary to perform well through online courses, certifications, reading up on medications, treatment guidelines, and so on. Everything was going smoothly despite cycling through 4 different bosses in my first 5 years. Nobody really wants to be in charge there. Financially speaking, it's a sinking ship since it's government run and reliant on tax funding. Then friendly boss Lena enters the picture. Or Lena. I'll just call her Lena. She asked me to transition to a new department the state was now legally required to provide short-term care through. She had previously headed the emergency care unit at the local hospital and didn't take nonsense from anyone. She let us workers build and run the department ourselves. Because as any good leader should, she recognized that we understood our work better than anyone, since we were doing it every single day. As long as we stayed within the applicable laws, regulations, staffing requirements, and budget, of course, things were outstanding for nearly 2 years. Every month, I put together the schedules for all 15 staff members. I handled daily planning for all patients. I was responsible for all documentation and for implementing every new guideline and protocol, since the type of care being provided was entirely new in our area. Then came the day of great sadness, when Lena announced she was leaving after being offered a position as head chief at the local hospital. All of us were heartbroken to see her go. But good for her, right? That's when Superbit C. Katza enters our story. She was already the supervisor of all the standard elderly care units where I'd worked previously. I had already moved on to short-term care before she was brought on as boss, and we had heard nothing but terrible things about her. Word was she always did what she believed was correct, which was almost always completely wrong because she was underqualified, had no hands-on experience in the actual work, and was just generally difficult. At our first staff meeting, she told us, "Either you're with me or you're against me. And the people who are against me, I drown in the local lake." Okay, great start. And by the way, guys, I'm getting some strong Soviet Union vibes here. Either way, I then tried to explain that under our previous boss, we had operated on mutual trust, since Lena understood that the workers themselves knew what functioned best in our department. Kutsa shut it down immediately. She said, "No, I'm the boss. I set the protocols. I decide how my departments are run." So I replied, "Yeah, of course, but I'm just saying we've been working like, no, I'm a boss. I'm in charge." And so it began. She started overhauling the schedules, the protocols, the staffing requirements, the daily rehabilitation schedule, even the food schedule, no joke. And she lowered the required medical competency threshold for working in our unit. This meant people were now being assigned to us with no prior experience in the job, no background in the field, who barely spoke the language, and so on. Keep in mind, we were dealing with dementia evaluations, palliative care, end-of-life care, stroke rehabilitation, and more. Now for the malicious compliance. Kutsa began attempting to micromanage absolutely everything we did, literally everything. She canceled all the activities we organized for the residents, like pub nights for the elderly, movie nights, the summer cafe, outdoor walks, shopping trips, all of it. And by the way, all of these came at zero cost to the facility. She declared that we were no longer permitted to finalize the schedules ourselves and gave us 2 weeks less time to complete them. This meant we now had just 1 week to draft the schedule, try to coordinate it among the 15 of us, and then pass it to her. She'd finish it and hand it back the day before it took effect. And 8 out of 10-day shifts would end up uncovered, or we'd have 6 people scheduled for the same weekend that was supposed to have 3. So I told her I'd been managing the schedule for years and was glad to keep doing it, and that she'd still receive it 2 weeks in advance. Her answer was no. I told her our activities fell entirely within paid, working hours, placed no strain on daily operations, and that we simply wanted to continue them. Once again, no. I told her we preferred to keep doing things the way we had been for years, because it worked exceptionally well. But no, obviously I was furious. So were my coworkers, but none of them ever spoke up. That was apparently my role. And there were plenty of other incidents I won't even get into Just imagine that virtually anything we ever wanted to do for our patients, for the residents in the dementia units, or for staff well-being was met with a flat no. One thing that had remained consistent since I began working there at 17, I was 27 at this point in the story, was that when you applied for vacation or any form of leave, you submitted the leave request and then arranged for a temp to cover your shift, then informed your boss that both had been done. It had always been that way, without exception. So I did exactly that. I requested a day's leave. My mom had a medical appointment in a town a few hours away, submitted the temp request, and walked over to the boss's office to let her know. She completely lost it. Perhaps because Katz's own boss happened to be present. I'm not sure. But she started yelling, telling me I was not allowed to request temps. That was her responsibility. So I just stood there, absorbed it like a composed employee, and simply said, "Okay, won't happen again." Well, she was in for quite a surprise when the next staff meeting rolled around. Suddenly, there were no staff members present on the actual ward, and a local politician had been left waiting with her mother, who was being admitted to my ward that day, for over 2 hours. I wonder who made sure they arrived at exactly that time on that day. I informed my boss precisely why no temp had been arranged ahead of the meeting, and in the end, Katza got fired, which will bring a smile to my face for the rest of my life. Now let's continue with today's entitled serial trespasser story. One thing I don't hear discussed nearly enough is what happens when someone owns a rural property in an area that's no longer particularly rural, and everyone in the vicinity seems to believe they have an inherent right to it. Over many years, I've had to chase away people who treat my land as though it's a free-for-all field rather than private property. Despite signs clearly marking it as private, they never seem to work. Half the people either can't read or simply don't care. I never get annoyed at one-time offenders who might genuinely not realize they've stepped onto my land. If I come across someone, I politely explain the situation, point them toward the nearest sign, and send them on their way. It's the ones who keep coming back with no regard whatsoever that I find truly intolerable. And this one entitled individual, I'll call him Ken, was the absolute worst. Ken seemed to feel that since my property was the only genuinely rural space within a 15-minute drive, it was perfectly suited to his needs, specifically for two purposes. First, as a running trail for exercise, and second, to set up targets and practice shooting, carrying himself not even as a guest, but as though it were his own land. I'd removed him fairly calmly for the running on prior occasions, but when I caught him shooting on my property, that was an entirely different matter. Me? Whoa, you absolutely cannot be doing that here. I've told you before to stay off my property. Ken, you need to back off before someone gets hurt. I want to practice, and you can't just decide who is and isn't allowed to use the park. Me? This is not a park. It's my land, and I've told you politely multiple times. And now you're showing up with firearms, potentially putting people at risk. Ken, I was here just 2 days ago, and this entire area was filled with kids playing soccer. Me? Those are my kids and their friends they'd invited over. I have the final say over who is permitted on my property, and you are not welcome here, ever again. Pack up your things and leave before I call the police for showing up at my home with a weapon. He actually packed up and left, but I knew with certainty that wasn't going to be the last time I'd encounter Ken. He still genuinely believed he had every right to be on my property, so I decided I was going to do something he simply couldn't overlook. I made sure to verify it was all fully legal first and went through about 1 million regulations before it was ready, during which time I caught Ken on camera trespassing on my land approximately 4 more times. Eventually, a large, imposing electric fence was installed around my property, complete with cameras, warnings, and numerous signs, along with, of course, appropriate access points for those who legitimately belonged there. I wasn't trying to construct some strange fortress. It wasn't electrified yet, but it was fully erected with all the signage when I caught Ken on camera creeping up with a rifle. I filed a police report for trespassing with a weapon and was informed they would speak with him. I don't know what was said, but it clearly had no effect because Ken came back, fully prepared to do more target practice. This time, the fence was live, and he got the shock of his life. He was absolutely furious and began pointing his firearm and firing directly through the fence toward my house. I called the police, who responded quickly, bringing a still-raging Ken to the ground and placing him in handcuffs. He even managed to punch an officer, drawing blood, which made me question whether Ken was under the influence of something, drugs or steroids perhaps, given his behavior and volatility. He ended up going to trial for all of it. But rather than focusing his energy on staying out of prison, he decided to attempt suing me for assault, claiming his shooting was self-defense and trying to have his charges reduced to perhaps just the officer assault. The civil suit he filed against me made the overall legal situation somewhat more complicated, so I'll simplify things rather than walking through the entire court proceedings blow by blow. Much of it wasn't particularly dramatic, just a lot of camera footage showing him trespassing and even attempting and failing to scale the electric fence. Then a lawyer hit him with a question that caused his entire defense to collapse. Lawyer, are you stating that you deny trespassing onto Opie's property on multiple occasions? Ken, I have never been on his property. I was minding my own business and he got cut off. Lawyer, so all these videos of you entering the property that have been submitted to the court are inaccurate? Is that man in the footage you? Ken, yes, it's me. I go there to do some shooting practice and get a decent trail run in. I want to stay in shape. You're acting like that's some kind of crime. Lawyer, so you're admitting to the trespassing allegations. Ken, you don't know anything. Trespassing means entering someone's actual house, and there's not a single video of me doing that. Just being near the place doesn't mean I went inside. And yes, he was using the old-fashioned outside equals public property argument to claim otherwise, still insisting the electric fence constituted assault on my part and that I couldn't designate the area as private or control who accessed it. Even the court had difficulty getting it through his head that he had no right to come onto my land and do as he pleased. That was genuinely private property, and that installing a fence was entirely within my legal rights in my state. Since Ken had absolutely no ability to keep himself composed for even 3 seconds, he launched into an expletive-filled rant and had to be physically removed from the courtroom because he refused to stop. Beyond that, the rest of the proceedings were fairly standard. General trespassing charges, resisting arrest, and assaulting a police officer. Nothing I think warrants particular focus here. The one other thing people might be curious about is whether he faced consequences for carrying a firearm. I know some jurisdictions are strict about that. He had legally owned the weapon and held a valid carry permit. Naturally, following this entire ordeal, he was no longer permitted to own a firearm due to the felony conviction now on his record. I would have expected a more significant prison sentence, but honestly, it was a bit underwhelming. He was only given a year in jail before being allowed back into society. I can also imagine that when he gets out, no officer is going to give him an easy time after he punched one of their colleagues. I was simply relieved that I no longer had to spend the rest of my life chasing this idiot off my property. One final note, I know some of you might take issue with me having an electric fence. Just know that I put it up primarily to deal with Ken specifically, and I don't keep it connected to power anymore. It's more of a deterrent at this point. I genuinely don't want anyone to get hurt, even if they're ignoring the signs. But if another Ken ever comes along, I can switch it back on and teach that person a lesson as well. And yeah, ripe stars. I wouldn't call Opie an a-hole at all for installing an electric fence. I think it's one of the smartest moves you can make when you're dealing with a persistent, serial trespassing neighbor. Either way, the next one is a malicious compliance story. Years back, I received an unexpected weekend call from a former coworker, Keith. His parents were getting on in age and needed assistance. So he had resigned from his position and moved back home to help care for them. After some pleasantries about how the move had gone and how the kids were settling in somewhere out in rural Ohio, I finally got him to explain why he'd reached out. Keith, my former boss, and has gone completely scorched earth. She took my resignation personally and is now making it impossible to return all the company equipment I have. Me? What do you mean by impossible? Keith, well, before the move, I tried to arrange a time to drop everything off at the office. And, through her secretary, told me that if I set foot on the premises, she'd have me trespassed. Me, ouch, Keith. So I FedExed it, 3 boxes that cost me nearly $300 with insurance. She refused delivery, and they arrived back on my porch this morning. Me, good grief. The company normally covers shipping for that kind of thing, so I can arrange a pickup if you'd like. Keith, she'll just refuse it again. What would actually be helpful is a copy of the employee manual. I have one, but it's buried in a box in the garage. I emailed over a copy. And then Keith asked me a curious question. Will any of our group be attending next week's convention in Cleveland? Me. Well, checking the calendar, the VP of Sales, Irish Terry for marketing, and are all going. Why? Are you trying to avoid them? Keith. Oh no, just wanted to be aware, that's all. Enter the malicious compliance. You see, the employee manual stated that Keith was required to return his equipment to his boss. It did not specify where, when, or how, and was absolutely livid when, on the very first day of the convention, Keith strolled up to their booth with a hand truck and, after some casual conversation with the VP, asked her to sign a receipt for the 2 laptops, monitor, and fax machine. According to Irish Terry, the VP's presence was the only reason the ensuing screaming fit didn't escalate into physical violence. Screaming or not, N's outburst on the convention floor was mortifying enough to the VP that he sent her home early, with the 3 large boxes of Keith's returned equipment in tow. The next one is another malicious compliance story. Briefly, during the pandemic, I was working as a manager at a Ralph's, a New York City area ice cream chain. One evening, as I was helping out at the scoop counter, I heard a customer getting agitated at the window and starting to snap at one of the young staff members working there. Naturally, I headed over to defuse the situation as the manager. The woman was upset because the hot fudge on her hot fudge sundae was hot and was, in her view, going to melt the ice cream. I explained to her that hot fudge is, in fact, served hot, but she was insistent. So I made her a fresh sundae using magic shell topping instead and let her keep the original hot fudge one. By the time I returned with a new order, this customer was stirring her spoon through another cup of ice cream, the same kind she'd ordered, clearly gearing up to complain about that one too. The flavor she'd ordered was called Graham Crunch. She proceeded to inform me that there wasn't nearly enough Graham Crunch in it, that she ordered this flavor regularly, and that she was certain I was deliberately shortchanging her. I told her that this was simply how the flavor was made, and that I neither named nor manufactured the ice cream. But she wasn't having it. She wanted me to fix it. Now, we had some crushed graham cracker topping in the back. As she continued berating me at the window, I simply walked away, retrieved the entire container, and came back to the window with it. At this point, there was a line of people stretching down the block. This woman had held everyone up, so there were plenty of witnesses to what I was about to do. Without breaking eye contact with her, as she kept insisting I was wrong about the ice cream, I opened the lid of the container and emptied the entire thing over her cup of the offending ice cream. Graham crackers went everywhere, and her ice cream was now undeniably, unmistakably crunchy. She completely lost it and started yelling at me, telling me she knew the owner and was going to get me fired. I said, "Yeah, Steve, a good guy." She shot back, "I've known Steve for a long time." To which I replied, "Well, his name is John. Now get out of here and stop harassing my employees for free ice cream." Sufficiently humiliated in front of a long line of waiting customers, the woman stormed off and indeed never came back. The next few customers left $20 tips in the jar to compensate for the disruption. So the kids working for me went home with considerably more in their pockets than usual and knew without a doubt that their manager had their back. And yeah, ripe stars. Major props to Opie for being such a legendary manager. That's exactly the kind of boss I'd want to work for, assuming I weren't self-employed, of course. The next one is a wonderfully funny petty revenge story titled Defeating Inconsiderate Neighbor with the Power of Girly Music and Sense. I firmly believe in giving someone a taste of their own medicine when they're being a jerk. We've all heard stories about loud, rude neighbors, especially in apartment buildings, and I will genuinely never understand how someone can be that thoughtless. But you know what? At this point, I'm done caring. I've put in a lot of effort to stay quiet despite others being noisy and obnoxious, and I have completely had it. I've decided to do something about it. I'll give it right back, loudly, and I can guarantee you're not going to enjoy it. For some context, the person living above me was your quintessential alpha male type, though I'm the only one who matters, energy personified. He drove an obnoxiously loud car that he just had to leave idling for a full 10 minutes so the entire neighborhood could hear it. He was completely inconsiderate about shared spaces, didn't care in the slightest whether he was bothering anyone, and blasted music late at night when everyone was trying to sleep. You could actually feel the vibrations through the floor. It was a nightmare, and despite speaking to him directly about it, he just kept doing it. We even brought it up with our building manager, but nothing came of it. So I did what any rational person would do. I started blasting Taylor Swift, aimed directly up at the ceiling and out the window whenever he came down to his loudly idling car. The entire night, it was nothing but Taylor Swift on repeat. And by the way, oh, you're so manly, strolling through the hallways smelling of strawberry pound cake from Bath & Body Works. If you want us to suffer through your noise, you can suffer right through our girly music and scents. Needless to say, that was the first night the music stopped thumping from above, and he was out the door the moment his car started up the next morning. And yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again tomorrow.